The air does not smell like war. It smells like melting gold and burning cedar. We are standing on the docks of Delos, the great slave market of the Aegean. But the story does not begin here. It ends here. It ends in a reflection of a polished bronze mirror held in the trembling hand of a woman who, until yesterday, walked through temples as if she owned the gods themselves. Now, that mirror does not reflect the painted ceiling of a palace. It reflects the gray, indifferent sky of a holding pen. It reflects a face smeared with ash, eyes wide and unblinking, staring back a reality that refuses to make sense. Around her, the noise is deafening, yet she hears none of it. She does not hear the shouting of the auctioneers, the rough barking of Roman officers, or the weeping of the thousands of women pressed against her. She focuses only on the metal in her hand, a small, circular disc of bronze, polished until it shines like a second sun. It is the last piece of Corinth she has. It is the last piece of herself. A heavy hand, callous and smelling of iron, reaches out and snatches the mirror away. The woman does not scream. She does not fight. She simply watches as a soldier inspects it, not for its beauty, but for its weight. He tosses it onto a pile of other confiscated items, bracelets, rings, hairpins, a mountain of glitter and debris that once defined the elite of the ancient world. The mirror lands face up. For a split second, it catches the sun, blindingly bright. Then, a boot steps on it. The bronze bends. The reflection distorts. The face of the queen is gone, replaced by the shadow of the conqueror. This is not a story about a battle. Battles are simple. They have beginnings and ends. This is a story about what happens after the swords are sheathed. It is about the moment when a civilization is turned into inventory. It is about the women of Corinth, the queens, the priestesses, the merchants, who woke up as the envy of the Mediterranean and went to sleep as cattle. If you want to hear the stories that history tries to bury under the rubble of victory, the stories of those who paid the price for empires they did not build, then surely you are in the right place. Subscribe and let us walk through the ashes together. To understand the horror of the fall, we must first understand the height from which they fell. Before the smoke, there was only light. Corinth was not just a city. It was a sensory experience. Situated on the isthmus connecting two seas, it was a master of the trade routes, the city of two harbors. If Athens was a school of Greece, Corinth was its marketplace, its bank, and its brothel, all wrapped in white marble and draped in purple silk. Imagine walking to the Agora in the spring of 147 BC. The sun hits the limestone streets so hard it hurts your eyes. The air is heavy with the scent of spices from the east, perfume from Arabia, and the salty tang of the sea. But above all, there is a shimmer of bronze. Corinth was famous for its bronze, a specific alloy, treated with gold or silver that did not tarnish. It was used for statues, for armor, and most importantly, for mirrors. Every woman of status carried one. It was a symbol of the city itself, obsessed with image, obsessed with beauty, and incredibly dangerously wealthy. The women here were unlike any others in the ancient world. In Rome, a woman was property of her father or her husband, expected to sit at the loom and stay silent. In Corinth, women were visible. They were the wives of the great merchant princes, yes, but they were also the gears that kept the city turning. They managed vast estates while their husbands were at sea. They funded public works. And high above the city, on the towering rock of the Acrocorinth, stood the temple of Aphrodite. Here, 1,000 sacred servants, women dedicated to the goddess of love, lived and worked. History has often dismissed them as mere prostitutes, but that is a Roman lie told to justify their enslavement. To the Corinthians, they were intercessors. They were the bridge between the city's wealth and the gods' favor. When they walked down the mountain in their saffron robes, the crowds parted. They wore jewelry that would have bought a Roman senator's villa 3 times over. Necklaces of heavy gold, armbands of twisted silver, and always the mirrors, catching the light, flashing signals of power across the crowds. They lived in a world of polished surfaces. They saw themselves reflected in the eyes of their lovers, in the admiration of the poor, and in the bronze they held in their hands. They believed that this reflection was permanent. They believed that beauty was a shield that could not be pierced by iron. They looked at the maps and saw Corinth at the center of the world. But on the horizon, across the Ionian Sea, a shadow was lengthening. The Roman Republic had just finished destroying Carthage, burning it to the ground and salting the earth. Now, the wolf was turning its head east. The women of Corinth looked in their mirrors and saw queens. The Roman Senate looked at Corinth and saw only a competitor that needed to be liquidated. There's a myth that we tell ourselves about ancient warfare. We imagine that cities fall because they are weak or because they are decadent. We look at the statues of weeping women and imagine them as passive victims, waiting for the inevitable. But the truth of 146 BC is far more uncomfortable. The women of Corinth were not passive. They were the fuel that kept the war machine running. When the Achaean League, the confederation of Greek states led by Corinth, foolishly declared war on Rome, the city did not collapse in fear. It mobilized, and it was the women who led the charge. We have accounts, fragmented but telling, of the mood inside the city. It wasn't hysteria. It was a cold, hard resolve. The men needed weapons. The mercenaries needed pay. And the treasury was not enough. So, the daughters of Corinth began a ritual of reverse adornment. Picture a candlelit chamber in a villa on the slopes of the Acrocorinth. The shutters are closed against the heat. A group of women, the elite of the city, stand around a heavy wooden table. One by one, they unclasp the heavy gold torques from their necks. They slide the rings from their fingers. They take the jewel pins from their hair. The pile of gold grows in the center of the table, shimmering in the candlelight. This was not charity. This was an investment. They were buying their own survival. They were stripping themselves of their vanity to forge shields and arrowheads. There is a terrible irony in this image. The very wealth that made them targets for Rome was now being melted down to fight Rome. They believed they could buy victory. They believed that if they sacrificed enough gold, enough silver, enough of their identity, the gods would protect them. They did not understand that they were fighting a new kind of enemy. Rome did not care about the favor of Aphrodite. Rome ran on a cold, administrative calculus. The mirrors were the only things they kept. Perhaps they couldn't bear to part with them. Or perhaps they needed them to remind themselves of who they were as the world around them began to strip away their luxuries. They kept the mirrors, tucking them into the folds of their robes, checking them nervously as the reports from front lines grew worse. The Romans are at the isthmus. The Achaean army has been routed. The general has fled. The myth says they waited to be saved. The reality is that they bought the swords that failed to protect them. The siege was not a long, drawn-out affair. It was a sudden, violent punctuation mark at the end of the sentence. The Achaean army, funded by the jewelry of their wives and mothers, met the Roman legions under General Lucius Mummius. It was a slaughter. The Greeks were disciplined, but the Romans were a machine. The Achaean general, Diaeus, the man who had promised these women victory, did not die fighting. He fled the battlefield, rode back to his own home, killed his wife to save her from slavery, and then took poison. He left the women of Corinth alone. For 3 days the city waited. Mummius, the Roman general, did not enter immediately. He suspected a trap. He could not believe that the great city of Corinth, the jewel of Greece, was undefended. Those 3 days must have been a peculiar kind of hell. The gates were open. The walls were unmanned. The women of Corinth were trapped in a limbo between freedom and erasure. The atmosphere in the city shifted from defiance to a heavy, suffocating dread. The sound of weaving looms stopped. The markets were empty. The only sound was a wind whistling through the empty archways and the low murmur of prayer. Women gathered in the courtyards of their homes. They didn't speak of victory anymore. They spoke of hiding places. They buried their remaining treasures in the gardens, not the gold, which was gone, but the small things, the heirlooms, the clay dolls of their children, the mirrors. They adjusted each other's robes, a nervous twitch, a phantom limb of their old lives. They brushed their daughter's hair, counting the strokes, trying to impose order on a world that had dissolved into chaos. They stood on the rooftops and watched the smoke rising from the battlefield outside the walls. They saw the Roman campfires, thousands of them, twinkling like fallen stars, a ring of iron tightening around their throats. Every time they looked at a mirror now, they were saying goodbye to the face they saw. They knew, with the instinct of the hunted, that the woman looking back at them would not exist in a week. Then, on the third morning, the trumpet sounded. Not the frantic, high-pitched horns of the Greeks, but the deep, rhythmic, terrifying brass of Rome. The entry of the legions was not a battle. It was a harvest. Mummius had given the order: kill the men, enslave the rest, burn the city. The soldiers poured through the gates like a gray flood. They moved with the efficiency of men who had done this 100 times before. There was no glory here, only butchery. The remaining men of Corinth, the elderly, the infirm, the young boys, were cut down where they stood. Their bodies were left in the streets, stepping stones for the legionaries as they moved toward the prizes. And the prizes were the women. The scene inside the city was a nightmare of contrast. The beautiful, sun-drenched courtyards, filled with jasmine and fountains, were suddenly invaded by blood and soot. The soldiers didn't just grab the women. They stripped them of their context. A woman is a queen because of her setting, her clothes, her home, her servants. The Romans stripped that away in seconds. Jewelry that had not been donated to the war effort was ripped from ears and necks. If a ring wouldn't slide off a finger, the finger was removed. The sound of tearing fabric and shattering pottery filled the air. In the temple of Aphrodite, the sacred servants huddled around the altar. They thought their goddess would protect them. They thought their sacred status gave them immunity. But the Romans did not see priestesses. They saw high-value merchandise. They were dragged by their hair across the mosaic floors. The statues of the goddess were toppled, smashing into the polished marble. The central motif of their lives, the mirrors, the glass, the gold, came crashing down. We see a young mother, clutching her child, cornered in a garden. She holds up a hand, perhaps offering a bracelet. A last bribe. The soldier takes the bracelet. Then he takes the child. The woman is bound, her hands tied behind her back with rough hemp rope that bites into skin that is known only silk. She looks down. At her feet, in a puddle of water mixed with ash, she sees a reflection. It is fractured, rippled, broken. The fire started in the lower city and raced up the hill. The cedar roofs caught instantly. The smoke turned the day into twilight. The city of light was extinguishing itself. The march to the ships was a procession of ghosts. They were herded out of the burning city, a long, weeping column of humanity. The queens of Corinth, who had once traveled in litters carried by slaves, were now walking barefoot on the sharp stones of the road. They were brought to the holding pens near the harbor. This was the market of souls. Here, the Roman bureaucracy took over. The violence of the sack was chaotic. The violence of the market was cold and orderly. Scribes sat at wooden tables, dipping their reed pens into ink, ready to catalog the loot. The women were stripped naked. It was the final humiliation, the final stripping away of their Corinthian identity. A Roman doctor would inspect them, checking teeth, checking hips, checking for disease. They were poked and prodded like livestock. One female, aristocrat, good teeth, breeding age. The scribe wrote it down. The woman who had been Thea, wife of a councilman, mother of two, priestess of the Silver Temple, was erased. She became Lot 412. They were sorted into groups. The old and the useless were often killed on the spot or sold for pennies to work in the mines, a death sentence in slow motion. The young and beautiful were set aside for the high-end markets in Rome and Delos. In the chaos of the sorting, families were separated, a mother reaching for her daughter, their fingers brushing for one last second before a spear, but drove them apart. That touch, that final, desperate tactile memory, would have to last them a lifetime. Around them, the soldiers played dice on the inverted shields, gambling with the jewelry they had stolen. A soldier laughs, holding up a polished bronze mirror, checking his teeth in it. He tilts it, and the sun flashes into the eyes of a captive woman. She looks away. She cannot bear to see the instrument of her vanity in the hands of her destroyer. The ships were waiting. Heavy, deep-bellied grain ships and triremes, repurposed to carry human cargo. The women were packed into the holds. The darkness was absolute. The air grew hot and fetid, smelling of unwashed bodies, vomit, and fear. As the ships pushed off from the docks, the women could hear the sound of their city dying. The roar of the fire was loud enough to be heard over the waves. The sky behind them glowed an angry, bruised purple. They were leaving the center of the world. They were being carried to the edges of the map. For days, they sat in the dark. The only way to mark time was the rhythmic creaking of the wood and the slap of the waves against the hull. In the darkness, the social hierarchy of Corinth dissolved and then reformed into something new. A noble woman might find herself pressed against a kitchen slave. In the dark, the silk didn't matter. The bloodline didn't matter. They were sisters in ruin. They whispered to each other. They shared sips of the stale water thrown down to them. They braided each other's hair in the dark, a phantom ritual of the boudoir, trying to maintain some semblance of humanity. "My name is Eleni," one would whisper. "Remember me. My name is Berenice. I live by the West Gate." They were memorizing each other. They knew that once they landed, they would be scattered like seeds in the wind. This darkness was the last time they would be a people. Occasionally, a hatch would open, and a shaft of blinding sunlight would cut through the gloom. A sailor would throw down a basket of hard bread. For a moment, dust motes would dance in the light, swirling like the sparks of the fire they left behind. One woman, perhaps the young mother we saw earlier, reaches into a hidden fold of her rags. She pulls out a shard of a mirror, a jagged piece of bronze she managed to hide. She looks at it in the sliver of light. It is too dark to see her face. She can only see her eye, one wide, terrified eye, staring back from the abyss. Back in Corinth, the silence had returned. The Romans had done their work well. The city was not just captured, it was murdered. The Senate had ordered that no stone should stand upon another. The walls were pulled down. The temples were roofless, their columns standing like broken ribs against the sky. The fires had burned themselves out, leaving behind a thick layer of black ash that covered everything. It covered the mosaics. It covered the fountains. It covered the bodies that had not been buried. The wind blew through the ruins, whistling through the cracks in the marble. It was a sound of utter desolation. Amidst the rubble, the motif of our story lies scattered. Thousands of bronze mirrors, melted by the heat of the fires, fuse into shapeless lumps of metal, shards of glass, pottery, and jewelry glinting in the dust. A Roman salvage team picks through the wreckage. They are looking for the heavy stuff, the statues, the bronze gates, the marble friezes to ship back to Rome. They ignore the small things. They step over a child's doll. They kick aside a broken loom. The city of Corinth, the Paris of antiquity, the city of mirrors, is now just a quarry, but the psychological imprint remains. The stones themselves seem to hold the memory of the scream. It is a place of ghosts, and for the Romans, it became a tourist attraction, a place to walk and say, "Look what happens when you defy us." But for the women who were dragged away, this ruin was not a symbol of Roman power. It was the gravestone of their lives. History is written by the victors, and the victors were men who wrote on wax tablets in Latin. They wrote that Corinth was destroyed because of the insolence of the Achaean League. They wrote about the generals and the senators. They wrote about the art that was stolen and how it improved Roman culture. They did not write about the women. The daughters of Corinth disappeared into the bloodstream of the Roman Empire. They were sold in Delos, in Ephesus, in Rome itself. The noble woman who once commanded an estate became a governess in a senator's villa, teaching his brutish children to speak Greek with a refined accent. The priestess of Aphrodite became a high-priced courtesan, using her skills to entertain the men who burned her temple. The merchant's wife became a scullery maid, scrubbing floors until her hands were raw. They were forced to learn Latin. They were forced to answer to new names: Corinthia, Achaia, Grecia, names that turned their trauma into a label of origin. But memory is stubborn. It survives in the quiet moments. Imagine a woman, 20 years later, in a villa in Tuscany. She is older now. Her hands are rough. She is arranging flowers in a vase for her master. She catches a glimpse of herself in a polished silver platter on the table. For a second, the years fall away. She sees the smoke. She hears the screams. She feels the weight of the gold torque she gave to the army. She touches her face. The reflection is older, harder, but the eyes are the same. She looks around to make sure no one is watching. She whispers a name, her true name, the name her mother gave her in the city of two harbors. She whispers it to the silver, and for a moment, Corinth is alive again. The sun sets over the Mediterranean. The water is a sheet of hammered gold, calm and indifferent to the history buried beneath it. We pan across the landscape of modern Corinth. There are ruins here, excavated by archaeologists. Tourists walk through them, taking pictures with their phones, looking at the broken columns. They see the stones. They read the placards. Temple of Apollo, Roman Forum. But if you look closely down in the dirt, you might see something glinting, a tiny fragment of bronze, green with age, corroded, unrecognizable to the untrained eye. It is a piece of a mirror. It has been waiting there for 2,000 years, waiting to reflect a face that will never look into it again. The destruction of Corinth was a warning from Rome to the world. Obey or vanish. But the story of the women of Corinth is a warning from history to us. Everything you build, everything you value, every reflection you admire is fragile. It can all be broken. It can all be sold. The mirror shatters. The jewelry falls. And the only thing left is the silence.